we've got a very special guest, a very well-known artist. Some of you may have heard of him. Picasso has joined us, and he's in the tent.
Picasso, the house husband indeed. Such has my life come down to the sweeping of my canvas home. Now, Byron was mentioning ruminants the other day in context of the giraffe, and so I thought I would just explain a little bit more about that, simply because I think we often talk about it, but we don't often really understand what's going on. So here is the stomach of a ruminant. This is the esophagus, which in this part of the world we spell something like this. Esophagus. And it would be attached, of course, to the throat and then the mouth with the teeth in it. Very nice. The rest of the animal will be drawn shortly. Normally no top teeth at all, actually. Right, then we go down. What happens is the grass, when it's, well, we better actually draw the creature immediately so that I can explain exactly how it works. I don't know what kind of an animal this is. Right, now what? I've never met anybody with such an appalling sense of proportion that I have. Right, so the grass goes into this animal's mouth, this pseudo cow auroch thing that we have going here, and there we are. It travels in here, and it is barely chewed the first time round, so it travels down. It's green, you see. It goes like this, and it skips this part here, and it goes into what we call the rumen. And in the rumen, the initial phases of a sort of bacterial digestion take place. So the rumen is this big chamber here. It's all over the place. There's all the rumen there. I think there's some baboons. Either that or Steph approaching the tent, I can't tell. We'll just keep an eye out there because I think there might be some baboons. So there we have the rumen, right? And that's where the giraffe or the auroch cow thing will store all of the grass in there. And then when the rumen is full, it lies down in the shade, or in the giraffe's case, just starts standing still and looking gormless. And then it goes and starts to re-chew its food. So it comes from the rumen, back up the esophagus, and is chewed by the grinding teeth of the auroch/cow. Then from here, and how the exact physiological mechanism of that, I'm not really sure. Then it goes into this part of the stomach here, where there is a different suite of bacteria living. This thing is called the reticulum. There we go. That is the reticulum. And from the reticulum, it goes down through here into the omasum. Can't believe I'm remembering this. And from the omasum, it goes back out into the abomasum. Right? And from there, it travels out into the small intestine. Right. I'm just going to write that now, small intestine. Whereupon it looks pretty much the same as it does on the rest of the animal. So the small intestine will be sort of meters and meters and meters. That, and then eventually it gets to the bottom where the tail is, and small black pellets come out, fall to the ground, and make a pile over here. and then what happens is that you get a dung beetle that comes along. And it eats the dung. So that is basically the ruminant's digestive system. David, could we just take a moment to look at the entire picture there? I think that's beautiful. Barry, I think you were saying that you didn't think my cow Auroch, sorry, Larry, you didn't believe that this would have stood the test of time, that is the evolutionary test. Yes, possibly not. Right. Tamira, you suggesting a GoFundMe page for drawing lessons. Tamira, I think that if you don't think I can draw, I think that you have very poor taste in art. Now, come over here, please. Samantha, you were looking for the biggest animal, or the biggest brain on the shelf of death. It was Samantha, wasn't it? Yes, it is. Samantha, the biggest brain on the shelf of death. Let's just have a look here. We have the absolute biggest brain, of course, and then we have the proportionately largest brain, which will dovetail quite nicely into Alice's. Is it Alice? Yes, Alice's question. I think the biggest brain is probably found in the buffalo on pure volume. So if we look into the buffalo skull, there is one outside. The buffalo skull probably contains about, I'm going to say almost a pint, just over a pint, say a pint and a half, a quart if you like, probably about a quart. That's about the volume of a buffalo's brain case. But proportionately, obviously, it's smaller than some of the others. Proportionately, the biggest we have are, unsurprisingly, these two here. The baboon and the monkey. I think it's probably easier if I sit down. Yes. The baboon and the monkey, and that's because they're primates. And we think that their brain size was largely driven, in much the same way as our brain size was largely driven, by sociality and the complex social bonds that exist between the animals in the troop. And that has driven the size of the brain to get a lot larger than proportionately in many other animals. But look at the monkey. The monkey compared with the baboon is even larger. So the circapathine primate, like this monkey, there are definitely baboons outside. Sorry, everyone. I can just hear them going. Now they're having a fight with each other just through there. But so proportionately, the circapathine monkey has got a much larger brain, and that is largely driven by, well, I mean, they can communicate. They do have a very rudimentary form of language, but they also have a tremendously complicated social structure. Now, that leads us to Alice's question about the honey badger. You wanted to see the honey badger skull. And we can show you the honey badger skull. I'm just going to fetch it, and I'm going to fetch it and compare it with something similarly sized. So the badger is here, and here is something similarly sized, and that is the civet. Here we are, okay? And then I also wanted to look at the hyena. Now, we know, and we used to discuss this a great deal, of course, because we used to have much hyena activity here, which we don't anymore, unfortunately. The hyenas have absconded to the north. The hyena skull, we often describe hyenas' brains as... Shut up! Baboons. We often discussed the hyena's brain and said how intelligent they were, and that intelligence was driven again by the fact that they have a very complicated social structure. Now, the brain, however, I don't think is proportionately any much larger than the lion or the leopard's brain. I'm really getting skulled dense here. I mean, there's the leopard, and there's the hyena, and I don't believe that that brain is proportionately any larger. I suspect, however, that there are parts of it that are proportionately larger than they are in the leopard. The leopard, of course, is about as antisocial as I am, versus a hyena, which is much more social. They like to live with each other. Leopards like to live completely alone. They don't wish to be around any other leopards. So I don't think they are that much bigger. So we often read about how they're so intelligent, the hyenas, but in my opinion, if I look at the brain case here, I don't see a huge difference. Now here you will see a difference. Alice, you're in Ohio. You said, can we look at the honey badger? Look at the difference here. This is the badger, and this is the civet. Now, I mean, these two animals weigh roughly the same. They don't have an entirely similar diet, but they're both relatively omnivorous, although they are carnivores. But if you look at the badger skull, you can see that the brain is almost, I would say, at least twice the size, wouldn't you, Dave? Mm. It's twice the size of that of the civet. Now, we know that badgers, of course, are very good problem solvers, and civets perhaps not so much. So I think that's fascinating. And a badger does not have a complicated social structure at all. A badger is very much a loner, actually very like a leopard, like most of the solitary animals out here. The only time you'll ever see them together with other badgers is a female and her youngsters. And that just isn't the case with these other big-brained animals like baboons and like monkeys. So I think that's really interesting. I think that this has been driven by the need to problem solve. And they thought initially that the apes, and therefore the human beings, had a brain that was driven to this size by the evolutionary pressure to problem solve, to tool make, to hunt as groups. And more research shows that it isn't that. Yes, there are elements of that have driven parts of the increase in size and bits of our brain. But largely, our tremendously complex social structure has driven the size of our brain, which I just think is very interesting indeed. Now, we had a nice question, and I've forgotten entirely what it was. Dan, you want to know if we have a hippopotamus skull? Well, Dan, there's an interesting story about that. I would have said until a little while back that, yes, we did have a hippopotamus skull. Here it is. And if we look at this, if you look at this carefully, what you can see is that it is the hippopotamus skull. The hippopotamus able to stick its eyes out of the water while keeping its head in a flat plane, and then it can stick its nose out of the water as well. So quite interesting that we do have this hippopotamus skull, except that it isn't a hippopotamus skull at all. It is a warthog skull. And the reason I say it's a hippopotamus skull is that that's exactly what I thought it was the first time I saw it out here. And it was during a fireside chat that we had in the morning, because we had the vehicles weren't working at all. So Brent and I did a lengthy section by the fire in the morning. And I went into this long treatise of how the hippo skull is designed so that it can smell and see and hear out of the water without sticking any of the rest of its body out the water. And Brent looked at me and he said, "You are joking, aren't you?" I said, "No, I'm not joking at all." And then I looked and I realized that I'd made a very obvious and stupid mistake in my attempt to just have something to say, and it was in fact a warthog skull, and I had to embarrassedly retract everything I've said. The hippo skull, not entirely dissimilarly shaped to this, I suppose, but probably an adult one about that big. So I'm afraid we don't have one in here to give a very long answer to a very short question, Dan. Let's put this back over here. So that's the brain discussion size, at least the brain discussion size. The brain size discussion. There we go. Excellent. And it is a fascinating one, and it's one that we don't really understand fully, I don't really think we understand how to define intelligence. We often define intelligence by the size of the brain, but what is intelligent? And a lion, although inescapably poor at calculus and apparently almost utterly untrainable as a domestic animal, is perfectly intelligent for what it has to do. Their life of violence and general theft and pillage, they're perfectly equipped to do, and their brains are large enough for that. Hyena, slightly different. It's very interesting, I think. Winter Prism, you say, do I think animals use more of their brains than humans? I think this is coming from the slightly apocryphal story that human beings only use 10% or something of their brain power. Now, I have read about this, And it's not really that we only use, small pieces of our brain. I think it's that most of our brains are not engaged all the time. And I imagine that it's not, I don't know, do I think that it's the same for animals out here? Winter prism, it could be. It could be the same. I suspect when they're at rest, they aren't using their brains particularly. But there's a lot more autonomic or a lot more... what's the word I'm using? Instinctive behavior involved in what animals do. And so I think you'll find that those sort of hardwired instinctive things that animals do out here probably take up quite a lot of their brain usage. Our brains are extremely flexible. They're extremely malleable. They're able to do things and plan and problem solve in the way that many other brains aren't. So perhaps ours do get used a bit more, at least a bit less, all the time than something like a monkey, but I'm really not sure about that. Let's head back to Byron and his hippopotami while I contemplate the size of brains, and let's ask Byron how big he thinks a hippopotamus's brain is.